And welcome to this third session on the Aryan issue. Those who were here yesterday, or those who were not here rather, we examined a few angles to this complex problem, and those angles were first of all the textual evidence, the geographical evidence, the archaeological evidence, and today it is actually an extension of the archaeological evidence, because archaeology gave us one essential message yesterday, which is that it is impossible to trace the coming of a new people into India in the second millennium BC. Whether Aryans with quotation marks or any other people, there is no sign and no clear identification among all the material cultures of the second millennium BC in the northwest of the subcontinent of a sudden cultural break which would be expected of a people entering the subcontinent from outside. So this is, if you like, a kind of negative verdict of archaeology. What I'm going to show you now is a positive verdict of a different nature. So let me put the issue like this. Those who maintain the Aryan invasion or migration in the second millennium BC, and therefore after the decline of the Harappan civilization, they claim that there is a complete cultural break. There are a lot of things which do disappear. For example, urbanism, naturally, this is the definition, in fact, of the decline of the Harappan civilization, that the phenomenon of urbanism ceases to exist in the second millennium BC. Then it is a fact that Harappan seals are no longer made, except for a couple of centuries, but let us say broadly in the second millennium BC they disappear also. The Indus or Harappan script, which unfortunately remains undeciphered, or at least let us say that no proposed decipherment, to be more precise, of the Harappan script has met with wide acceptance. That also disappears, as far as we can tell, though there have been a few suggestions of possible continuities, persistence in later centuries, but this is very speculative as of now. I will still show how the subject has been dealt with. And very importantly, the long-distance trade networks that the Harappan world had established even before the urban phase. Even before the urban phase, there is evidence of trade networks extending northward into Central Asia, especially for the trade in lapis lazuli, and westward as far as the trade in finished goods, especially the famous Harappan beads, was concerned. Now these networks expanded a lot during the mature or urban phase, which we saw yesterday, and then after this decline, in the second millennium BC, we find that these trade networks disintegrate. And trade must have continued, did continue in fact, but on a localized basis. So from one region to the next or so, you still have trade going on, but the extensive trade network has collapsed. So yes, there is a very strong mark of discontinuity, which has been used by the proponents of the Aryan invasion or migration to argue that what we have between the bright third millennium BC, where the Harappan civilization flourished, and the first millennium BC, when the Gangetic civilization, the civilization of the Ganga-Vindhya region, emerges, which takes place somewhere between 800 and 600 BC, when you have cities emerging all over the place, again from Mathura, Kaushambi, Varanasi, and many other urban centers emerging in the Gangetic plains, and not exclusively in the Gangetic plains, also in the north of the Indus Plains, you would have heard of a place called Takshashila or Taxila. That also begins around the same time. So that is a new civilization, if you like. It is the civilization that will give birth to the classical civilization of India. And that happens in the first half of the first millennium BC. So between those two civilizations, what do we have? We have, broadly speaking, the second millennium BC, during which the Aryan migration is supposed to, I will stop using the word invasion, since now all well-informed scholars at least have rejected the brutal invasion theory, though it is persisting in our textbooks, but I have spent enough time explaining that. So let me now use the simple terminology of Aryan migration into India. And this migration happens exactly in the middle of the second millennium BC for those who propose that still hold to the theory. And they see what has been called a dark age or a Vedic night. I am using actual quotations from the scholars. That is to say, the coming of the Aryans does not actually propagate immediately a new bright civilization, but rather a dark age, for which we will have to wait till 800 or 700 BC for the urbanism to re-emerge in the Ganges region. So this is the theory, and therefore, as I explained right at the beginning of this series, the Harappan civilization is seen as pre-Vedic, right? It precedes the Aryan migration, while the Ganges civilization is seen as Vedic and in fact late Vedic, because it is the result of the Aryan migration. So therefore we have a total break between these two civilizations, as if they have no point of contact, and the theory therefore wants the second millennium BC to be a period of discontinuity, and we would not expect much connection. In fact, the Harappan civilization is seen in this perspective as a kind of island in time and space, and an island in the sense that it has not contributed much to the birth of the classical civilization of India. It is not seen as a major contributor. This is precisely the thesis which I am this morning going to challenge. Because, in summary, there is, especially in the last 30 years, there has been an accumulating mass of evidence from the archaeological field to show that, in fact, the legacy of the Harappan civilization to the classical civilization of India, and sometimes in certain occurrences which you will see shortly, to even today's Indian civilization has been enormous. And we can no longer speak of an isolation for the Indus civilization. So let me get started by some examples from the tangible heritage of the Indus civilization. I will begin with the tangible heritage and move on to the intangible a little later. Of course, this has to be a fairly superficial presentation. I can only show you a fraction of the material that we have at our disposal today. Nevertheless, it should be sufficient to illustrate my purpose. So, here, for example, you see the typical plan of a large house in Mohenjo-daro. And what you notice immediately is that this house has a design which is familiar to us in India today. And the design is a central courtyard, and all the rooms are organized around it. In fact, for those here who are from Kerala, where we are speaking now, this is something which you would be very familiar with. And the same thing in Tamil Nadu, and the same thing in many parts of rural India, where this design survived and was adopted as something congenial to the environment, well suited to a heated and dusty environment, where it is advantageous to protect oneself from the environment outside and not to turn the house towards the outside but towards the inside. So this is something that the Harappan architects or town planners initiated. There are interesting features of construction techniques which the Harappans invented in fact, such as this well on the left, which has unexpectedly not rectangular bricks as the Harappans were making. They were making excellent bricks of rectangular proportions which are surprisingly modern looking. They are very much like our modern proportions. But in this case, for this well, which is from Mohenjo-daro again, and it is estimated that Mohenjo-daro might have had up to 700 wells. About half of them private, in private houses, and the rest in public spaces, like streets. And what you see here is that the bricks are not rectangular but trapezoid. The reason for the bricks to be trapezoid is because the Indus is flowing nearby, very close to Mohenjo-daro. And the water table, especially during the periods when the Indus would go into spate, which it continues to do every year, but in those days, when there were no dams on the Indus, you would expect, the spates of the Indus to be much more strong, violent, destructive. And the water table, underground water table, was very high. It is still pretty high today. And there would have been pretty massive infiltrations from the water table into the well. Therefore, a pressure exerted on the walls of the well. And if you use rectangular bricks, what's going to happen is that your bricks are going to be pushed inside, and at some point they will fall into the well, and the whole structure slowly and rapidly will disintegrate, and the well will collapse. So Harappans must have been confronted with this problem in the early phase of the civilization, and by the mature phase, somebody had a stroke of genius and created those trapezoid bricks, which, as you can well imagine, will lock together. And by locking together, the well can resist any amount of underground pressure. And this is exactly what they did. And the wells in Mohenjo-daro are well documented to have lasted for the whole lifetime of the city. So this is an innovation, and the innovation will not be lost. It will be transmitted to the Gangetic civilization, where a few structures exactly identical have been found, wells as well as bins, but the Ganges civilization gradually will prefer a different kind of well which will be built with terracotta rings. The advantage of having rings to build a well is that you can build your well from the top downward, and there is no danger to the workers. Whereas when you build a well with bricks, you have to build it from bottom up, and this is more delicate, especially when the infiltrations are strong. So therefore there is a survivance of these trapezoid bricks and this whole invention, which is quite remarkable, because in the Roman Empire this was one problem they were trying to tackle and could not find a solution to, which was that they were building square wells with stones, and regularly in places where the underground infiltrations were strong, they would find that the wells would collapse after a time. So even though the Romans were great hydraulic engineers, they couldn't solve this particular problem, which the Harappans had solved 2,000 years before them. However, the Harappans didn't have the idea of turning what is, practically speaking, a horizontal arch vertically. It didn't occur to them that they could use the same technique to build an arch with trapezoid bricks, because that's what arches are built with. And as you well know, these arches can support any amount of weight vertically. So they did it horizontally. Vertically they did not. They had what is called corbelled arches, like this one, which actually is, I believe, the outlet of the Great Bath of Mohenjo-daro, if I'm not mistaken. So this was, and this is something that will also be transmitted to the Gangetic civilization. Now, let us look a little bit at urbanism and architecture, where we are going to find fairly objective evidence of legacy, transmission, to later phases of Indian civilization. And this in fact is the upper city of Mohenjo-daro. Mohenjo-daro is divided, like most Harappan cities, into an upper city or upper town, also known as Acropolis, sometimes called citadel, but citadel is a military term which is a little bit tendentious. So I'm using the term Acropolis or upper city, and you will find many Harappan cities having an upper part and a lower part. And quite likely, very certainly I may say, the upper part of the city was where the rulers lived, and it was probably their privileged area. So whatever it may be, this is the Acropolis of Mohenjo-daro, and you can see immediately that there is a sense of planning, there is a sense of order, there is a sense of geometry. The streets are aligned north to south, east to west, and this is something which is a decision. It's a cultural decision. It is not a requirement. You can have a city without such alignments. In fact, most Indian cities, except those which were planned and executed in recent decades, most Indian cities are cities that are simply outgrown villages. The village grows into a town, the town continues to grow into a city. It's an organic growth. There is basically no planning, and it is not necessary either. So this was a conscious decision for a certain cultural reason of the Harappans, but they did not stop there. In addition, so this gives a sense of order, of course, naturally. It also tells us that there is an authority, someone who decides to implement this plan, and obviously who must be deriving a little bit of glory or satisfaction from this plan. So maybe the whole plan itself is a means of glorifying the authority. Sacred space, I will come back to it in a moment, but first of all, let me explain that we have a unique feature in Harappan cities, which was noted long ago in this limited sense that the Acropolis is twice as long as it is wide. And this proportion is going to occur in many other cities. So there is again a decision here. But it doesn't stop here. If you look at the plan corresponding to the slide I was showing you just before, this is again the Acropolis of Mohenjo-daro. You can see huge structures which have been called fairly arbitrarily. People now, archaeologists are questioning most of these designations, like granary, like college, like pillared hall. Great bath, of course, remains a bath, no doubt. But what happens here is something quite unexpected. This is my own little piece of research, incidentally. It is that every major structure in this Acropolis of Mohenjo-daro obeys certain fixed proportions or ratios to a very precise degree. The margin of error does not exceed, whenever we can measure it, does not exceed 1%. So very precisely, people, let us call them Harappan architects, decided to implement a very strict set of proportions on the landscape in the structures. And this again is a cultural choice. It is not necessary. It doesn't add anything except perhaps a sense of aesthetics or auspiciousness to your construction. Actually, it makes the construction more complicated because you have to combine all these proportions within a certain limited space. And yet they did it, and they did it not only at Mohenjo-daro, so I will not spend time explaining those proportions, you have seen them. But the Great Bath alone, which is here, as you can see, this is the famous Great Bath of Mohenjo-daro, to which we will return shortly. And you can see that this structure has not one set, but three sets of very precise proportions. The bath itself is 5 to 3 length to width. The colonnade is 7 to 5. This is a kind of a huge colonnade with a veranda and small rooms behind them surrounding the Great Bath. And then the overall structure is 7 to 4. So why these ratios? What do they mean for the Harappans? Let me try to propose an explanation. And remember that they are non-utilitarian. They do not fulfill any utilitarian purpose in terms of, let us say, structural strength or durability. Not at all. They are not required from that point of view. So they are a non-utilitarian cultural feature. This is a major building in the lower town of Mohenjo-daro, which incidentally again shows you the design of a central courtyard. In this case, there was a platform whose purpose is a matter of speculation. There is no agreement among the archaeologists, but whatever it may have been, there is a central courtyard and you have all the rooms neatly arranged around them, as precisely you could see today if you visit an illam of Kerala, for example. This is precisely what you will see. So the design has survived. Now here, in addition, the proportions are very precisely within 1% margin of error, 5 to 4. Now please keep in mind this 5 to 4 because it's going to recur. This is the so-called granary of Harappa, so-called because there's again no agreement as to whether it was really a granary. But the proportions, overall proportions are the same, 5 to 4. 5 to 4, as you know, is 1.25. So it means that you choose to have a length which is 25% longer than the width for whatever reasons that may be. And not only that, it consists of huge individual rooms. The whole building is huge, more than 50 meters in length, which would be perhaps twice the length of this hall, and more than 40 meters in width. And the ratio is precisely 5 to 4. So, but then within this there are those chambers which follow a different proportion of 5 to 2. Again, very precisely. If we continue, now we visit briefly Kalibangan. Kalibangan we saw on the Saraswati river. This is the dry bed of the Ghaggar, as you can see here. And Kalibangan has the same division between Acropolis or upper town here and lower town here, with, as you can see once again, highly geometric alignment of streets. So Kalibangan here in the upper city, the proportions are the same, 1 to 2, that we saw at Mohenjo-daro. So definitely there is a kind of a design. I won't call it a standardized design because there are variations from site to site, but there is a broad idea which has been accepted. Kalibangan would be, I don't exactly know, 7 to 8, no, maybe not, 600 perhaps kilometers away from Mohenjo-daro, and yet the design is broadly the same. As for the lower town, it would be roughly 3 to 2, though the southern wall was eroded, so this is a little speculative. So anyhow, the same sense of order and geometry. This is Lothal, a small town in Gujarat, south of Ahmedabad, about 70 kilometers south of Ahmedabad. And this is an important settlement made famous for a reason which I will explain very shortly. The overall town, if you take the fortifications at the middle points, here there is a slant, an angle imposed by the Nalla, which is on the northern side, and because the Nalla was not straight, so they decided to hug the Nalla and have the fortifications at an angle. But if you take the middle point, you get the same 5 to 4 ratio, which we have already seen twice. And at the bottom is what is called a dock or dockyard by the excavator, the late Dr. S.R. Rao. And this dockyard is enormous. It is 220 meters almost in length and 36 meters in width, therefore a ratio of 6 to 1. So again, nothing is left random, as it were. This is a view of the dockyard after a good monsoon, and the whole site of Lothal is here on the western side of the dockyard. Now we move to Dholavira. Dholavira is a huge Harappan city in the Rann of Kutch. Rann of Kutch is a very marshy, dry region on the north of Gujarat. It borders today the Indo-Pakistan border. And during summer, when it dries up completely, it is nothing but a wide expanse of salt. Nothing but salt. It is actually a former arm of the sea. And it was navigable not only in Harappan times, but even at the time of the invasion of Alexander the Great. We have documents from the Greek chroniclers which point out that the Run was navigable in those days. Not anymore today, but you can see when you look at the layout of the city, again, what is very striking is a sense of geometrical order. These people do not like, what might look amorphous or too organic. So this is something peculiar. You have in blue here, the upper city, which actually again respects a ratio broadly of 2 to 1. This is divided into a castle with massive fortification walls reaching a thickness of up to 19 meters. And then you have the middle town in pink, but in between there is a huge ceremonial ground about 280 meters long. Ceremonial because it is assumed that it would have been used for various ceremonies, possibly for melas or fairs, for all kinds of events, maybe games, maybe markets. So all these might have taken place at this location. And then there is a lower town, much of which was used for water harvesting, because very briefly the water from these two seasonal streams, would capture rainfall during the very brief monsoon. This is a very arid region where today there is no city, there is no town even, there are only hamlets. The nearest city is more than 100 kilometers away. So in this very difficult region, the Harappans decided to probably to control the trade and movements of raw materials coming from Gujarat, in particular semi-precious stones, and for whatever other reasons there may have been, including perhaps agricultural output to feed the Harappan cities. In any case, whatever the reasons may be, they chose to have this city in this difficult region, and they chose again to impose proportions on the layout. So 5 to 4 is the ratio of the castle. So 5 to 4 is also the ratio of the overall city to very high degree of precision. The margin of error is not even 0.01%. Not even 0.01%. So this is obviously a deliberate choice. Then the length of the castle to the length of the middle town, the ratio is 9 to 4, and this ratio is repeated between the length of the overall city and the length of the middle town. This incidentally, many of these proportions were noted by the excavator of Dholavira, Dr. R.S. Bisht, who excavated the city mostly in the 1990s up to the early 2000s. But I also added a few of these proportions. 6 to 1 is the ratio of the ceremonial ground, which we had seen already at Lothal. 7 to 6 is the ratio of the middle town, and it goes on. In fact, it goes on with the reservoirs of Dholavira. This is the huge eastern reservoir of about 73 meters in length, with the castle here in the background, to the west of it. And you can see that the ratio is exactly 5 to 2. It goes on. This is a rock-cut reservoir on the southern side of the castle, and it has two sets of ratios, 7 to 2 for the upper reservoir and 11 to 4 for the lower reservoir. So what does it all mean? What are they trying to do? Why do they complicate their lives by making structures which obey such strict proportions? Well, the answer can only be cultural, and I will try to give it in a minute. But this table which I have compiled lists a number of such major Harappan structures. In fact, I have not found one major Harappan structure anywhere so far that does not obey a simple proportion as those tabulated in this graph. And this is quite remarkable. And if we try to see the continuity of this, let us say, tradition, we see first of all that in the Vedic altars, there is a reflection of it, whether it precedes, whether this Vedic altar is from a date prior to the Harappan civilization or during or later, I am not discussing. I only say that we find something there also. And here there is the Mahavedi, the extended ground of sacrifice of the Vedic ritual, where interestingly on the eastern side you have 24 units, they are called prakrama, that doesn't matter to us, in the Shatapatha Brahmana in fact, 24 units of length on the eastern side and 30 on the western side, and the ratio 30 to 24 is exactly 1.25, which is the same 5 to 4 that we have been seeing in the Harappan cities. So there is an intention, and probably this ratio here means the growth that the sacrifice is going to bring to us, because any sacrifice is for a growth, whether you take it at an inner spiritual level or whether you take it at a purely outer materialistic level where you expect to have more riches or more progeny or whatever it may be. But in any case, you expect a growth, you expect a result. And this is perhaps what this deliberately trapezoid shape is trying to symbolize. In any case, the ratio is 1.25. So, if we look at the classical texts of architecture, in Indian architecture there are many texts, and this is known as Vastu Vidya, Shilpa Shastra, Shilpa Vidya, and so on. So all those texts are available, and when we look at some of them, this is from Varahamihira. Varahamihira was a well-known famous astronomer, astrologer, and also author of Brihad Samhita, which is a kind of encyclopedia of the ancient world. And of the classical world, which was his, he lived in the 6th century AD. 6th century AD, possibly at Ujjain, which was one of the cities that, one of the very ancient cities of the Gangetic civilization, in fact. And he writes in a chapter on architecture, on Shilpa Vidya, he writes, the length of a king's palace is greater than the breadth by a quarter. So he's saying that there are certain auspicious proportions, and if you want to respect them, you will grow, you will benefit. And for the king's palace, you take the breadth at a quarter of it and you get the length. Now this is exactly 5 to 4. So he's also telling us maybe how this ratio, how they are actually implemented on the ground. It's not that you measure 4, you measure 5, and you multiply by a unit. Not necessarily. You can just take any breadth and measure it with a rope, fold the rope into 4, double it and double it once again, and you add this to the breadth and you get the length. So this is a way to do it without measurement. And for the commander-in-chief, the Senapati, you exceed by a sixth, and therefore you get 7 to 6. And these are very exactly the proportions we noted for the castle and overall city of Dholavira and for the middle town of Dholavira. So there is something here which is a little too much of a coincidence, and we may be justified in proposing that those proportions of Harappan cities have migrated all the way to classical Indian architecture. And in fact, if I take even a more precise text like the Manasara, which is actually a South Indian text of architecture, much later, but it tells us how to systematically build the proportions. It says, you take the length, you take the breadth, and you increase by 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, twice, twice and 1/4, twice and 1/2, twice and 3/4, and you get all these ratios, and all of them are in Dholavira or other Harappan settlements, precisely the same ratios. So it is clear that there is here a tradition, call it a tradition of town planning, call it a tradition of architecture, or call it simply a tradition of aesthetics, because at bottom this may be what it is about. But in any case, the Harappans had this sense of auspicious proportions, and they were able to transmit them to the later classical civilization of India. Apart from this, there are other transmissions in town planning, such as the use of fortifications. This has been discussed by many scholars. The use of sanitation. Partly, the Gangetic cities have some drainage system, but not as extensive usually as what you would have seen in Mohenjo-daro, where almost the entire city was crisscrossed by a complex network of drainage. So, but some of the concept at least has survived, and a number of construction techniques like those I mentioned, for example, the house plan or the well with trapezoid bricks. Let me now move to another field, which is the field of metrology. Metrology is the art or technique of measuring units that allow you to measure anything: lengths, surfaces, volumes, weights, time, and so on and so forth. So we have a little bit of evidence of metrology in the Harappan world, like this scale or rod, if it is not a scale, at least a rod of Lothal, which carries those graduations which you can see. And those graduations have been repeated here on this modern scale, and they have been measured to be precisely 1.77 millimeters, which was proposed by Mainkar, an eminent metrologist of India in the 1960s and 70s. He proposed that 10 times this unit comes to what he himself had measured for the so-called angula of the Arthashastra. What is angula? It is defined, it is a unit of length defined as the width of the middle finger, or also 12 grains of barley put side by side. There are several definitions. So in the text of Arthashastra, which was authored by Kautilya is assimilated most of the time with Chanakya also. It is a text, as you know, of administration, governance, economics, and so on. Very rich, important text to understand the governance and administration of ancient India. And there is all these units are systematically defined in relation to each other. And according to Mainka, the Arthashastra unit of angula is 1.78 more or less centimeters. So he says there is a coincidence with the fact that it is 10 times the Lothal unit. In fact, I have proposed at Dholavira, but I will not take time to go into this in detail. I have proposed a angula from a completely different perspective, which came to 1.76 centimeters. In addition, a scale at Kalimangan came to light. Kalimangan, again on this Sarasvati, which has been measured by the late Professor Balasubramaniam of IIT Kanpur to be of 1.75. It's a crude scale of terracotta, but when you look at those divisions, they are 1.75 centimeters apart. So 1.75, 1.76. From my perspective at Dholavira, 1.77 at Lothal, there seems to be something going on. Though this is a study in progress, there are also scales at Mohenjo-daro and Harappa whose apparent units do not match these. So that remains to be explained. But in any case, these are well in continuity with the classical units as defined in the Arthashastra. So this is an important example of continuity. We have another very striking case of continuity in the weight system of the Harappans, which they had highly standardized across the whole civilization. Even in Oman, some of these Harappan weights were found following more or less the same standards as back home. And this weight system consists of two series. It was essential for the conduct of trade. The Harappans, as you know, were great traders, and they needed to weigh stuff, whether it was raw material of semi-precious stones, which they would buy, or finished beads of semi-precious stones, which they would sell, or whether it was quantities of grain to be used in barter trade, and so on and so forth. So what you see here is the unit of the whole system at the left, which possibly, which was usually around 0.86 grams, pretty standardized across the whole civilization. And then the following units would double in weight. Every unit would be double the weight of the preceding unit. So a simple geometric progression. But when you reach 64 times the first unit, the progression stops. Instead of having 128, suddenly you get 160, and then 200, 320, 640, etc. In other words, the first series is taken up and multiplied either by 10 or by 100, for example 200, or by even 1,000, for example 8,000 is 1,000 times 8. So there is here, first of all, this is important, a sense of multiplying by 10, multiplying by 100, multiplying by 1,000, which is not as trivial as one might think. So some limited mathematical conception, arithmetical conception, and interestingly based on apparently some kind of a decimal system, which is important to note because the full-fledged decimal system will be developed in classical India much later, of course, much later, thousands of years later, but perhaps there is here a seed of it. In any case, regardless of this, where the continuity is compelling is when you compare the Harappan weights which are here on top with the traditional Indian weights, and so this was done by John Michina, a British scholar, in the 1970s, if I'm not mistaken, where he compared those weights and he found that the Harappan weights, if you can follow my laser pointer, were almost identical, little bit on the higher side, slightly on the higher side, little bit, but otherwise almost identical to the traditional Indian weights. What do I mean by traditional Indian weights? Like the rati, the karsha, these are weights which were used even till pre-independence days in the Indian markets. With, of course, lots of regional variations, but there are also weights which are mentioned in texts like Arthashastra and other classical texts. So it does look as if the Harappan weight system survived completely, and this is confirmed by none other but D.D. Koshambi, the father of Marxist historiography in India, who was also a mathematician and who conducted a statistical analysis of coins found at Takshashila. These coins are silver coins called punch-marked coins because they have a lot of emblems and symbols. I'm coming to that in a few minutes. Punched into the silver, as you know, is a very soft metal. And when he analyzed them, he found that the Harappan pattern of weights was what these coins followed at Takshila, therefore dating back to approximately 5th century or 6th century BC, 2000 years after the Harappan weights. And D.D. Koshambi said that the Takshila punchmark coins are patterned on the Mohenjo-daro system of weights. So the continuity is not in question, and therefore this is a very important, in fact, Harappan legacy, part of the tangible legacy which I've been telling you about. Apart from that, I believe experts like Jonathan Mark Kenoyer or many of our Indian archaeologists who have studied the arts and crafts of the Harappan civilization, and you have here a beautiful example of it,
would be able to give you hours of lecture on how many of these techniques, craft techniques, bead makings, but not only that, have survived in later India and sometimes right up to today. And for example, Professor Kuldeep Bhan of MS University of Baroda with Kenoya and Massimo Vidale, an Italian archaeologist, did a lot of work at Khambat, a site on the Narmada River in Gujarat, where there are communities of craftsmen using techniques which are almost identical to the Harappan techniques of bead grinding, bead polishing, bead drilling, and bead bleaching to create motifs on the beads. So I don't spend time on this, but you can take their word that these techniques have survived. And in fact, not only the techniques, but the design sometimes, like these flat golden beads, flattened, but still with a little tube in the center to allow a string to pass. These have been used in many rural cultures of India, and they are still used in some tribal cultures today. Bangles, as you can see, these are gold bangles, but the Harappans made them in every possible material: bone, ivory, terracotta, copper, bronze, faience, and a few more, which I forget. Shell, for example. So they were extremely fond of bangles, and this is the beginning of, the love that Indian ladies have for bangles, and you will not rarely see an Indian lady without wearing some kind of bangle. So it is a Harappan tradition. Let me move on, because there would be too much to say on this point alone. Very striking continuity in ornaments. This is part of the tangible heritage. This is a beautiful foot of a bronze figurine from Mohenjo-daro. We are sorry that the rest of the figurine has now survived. This is very unfortunate. We would love to see it. But the foot in bronze tells us a lot because of this anklet. And again, a bangle apart, the wearing of anklet is something which is almost universal in the Indian subcontinent, and it is nothing but a Harappan tradition. Another Harappan tradition is apparently documented at Nosharo. This is a late Harappan, actually an early Harappan site. It is an early and mature Harappan site, but this is from the early layers, just before the urban phase, where a few figurines have come up, like this one, where you can see traces of red pigment at the parting of the hair. And this is something which, of course, in India today, married Hindu ladies wear commonly. We cannot, of course, certify that it had the same purpose in the Harappan culture. That we do not know. Whether it was specifically for, indicating a status of being married or not, we cannot certify. But the application of red pigment is documented in this region at least, and this is a striking example of survival. This beautiful dancing girl, so-called dancing girl, we do not know really whether it is in a dance posture or simply indicating something, or striking a pose. It's hard to say. However, two things from the point of view of transmission and legacy are important to note here. One is, again, the wearing of the bangles. See, over the entire left arm. And you can see the same today in rural parts of Gujarat and Rajasthan. So this tradition has persisted. Second, the very technique of casting bronze is known as the lost wax technique, where very briefly you make a model of wax, surround it with clay, a special kind of clay, then you heat the whole thing at a high temperature. The clay hardens, the mold hardens, your wax of course melts away, and then you can turn your mold around, bury it in the ground, enlarge the hole at the bottom a little bit, and pour molten bronze through it, and then you will have your figurine. Of course you will still need to polish it and so. Now this very technique of lost works, bronze technique, bronze casting technique is still used by traditional bronze craftsmen in India today. Whatever traditional bronze figurines or statues you buy in India are made with this technique. And the transmission through the early historical phase is fairly well documented. Then games like dice, this is from Harappa. These dice are surprisingly modern looking, except that the numbers are not laid out in the way we would lay them out today. But otherwise, they look pretty much like our modern dice. And dice is an ancient game in India. If you remember Mahabharata, you know the game of dice, which triggered the whole, eventually the whole war of the Mahabharata. This is an Indian tradition which has Harappan roots. Not only dice, but whenever I show this slide in school, for example, and I ask the children, what is this? Everybody says, well, it's the game of dice, of chess. And why should they say so? Because of this, whom everybody says it's a horse. So remember our discussion yesterday about the horse. This is one more piece of evidence that the horse was sometimes, not often, unfortunately, but sometimes there are depictions that can be good candidates for the horse. Anyway, let us leave that aside. The point is we have a complex boards game here. Complex because there are different kinds of figurines which must have moved differently. It is not exactly chess, obviously, but it could be an ancestor of the game of chess. And remember again that chess is known to have been evolved in India. This is now well accepted all over the world. Classical India produced the game of chess, but classical India is 2000 or 3000 years after the Harappan civilization. So it may have Harappan antecedents. Then let me quickly touch upon agriculture. There would be much to say. I will not have time to do so, but I just want to show you this striking slide from Kalimangam. During the excavations at Kalimangam in the 1960s, Professor Bibilal, B.K. Thapar and their colleagues found in the phase just preceding the urban phase, which if you remember yesterday starts 2600 BC, so 200 years after this, they found that there were traces of furrows, long north-south furrows and short east-west furrows. And they were puzzled because normally when you plow a field, all your furrows are going to be in a single direction. That's the easy way of doing it. So why should you complicate your task and have two different directions? This is the question they ask themselves. And the beauty in India is that when you ask such questions, very often, but not always of course, but often enough, all you have to do is go to the nearby village and look around and ask. And when they looked around, they found that there was a farmer here plowing his field with this camel, and this farmer was following almost exactly the same design of perpendicular furrows. So when they asked him, he explained, and I'll very, very briefly explain that this is for the winter crop. Kalimangan is fairly of northern latitude, unlike South India, where this method would not work, because in the northern latitude, during winter, your midday sun on the southern horizon is going to cast a bit of a shadow, which would not be the case in South India. And this shadow, let it be confined to the north-south furrow, where they can have tall plants like mustard, for example, while the east-west furrows will not be affected by this shadow, and they can receive the sun from the southern quarter as well. So they can keep short plants in the east-west furrows, like various kinds of grams or vegetables or whatever. So this is a very good system of intercropping, as you see, it has survived for almost 4,800 years. Today I don't know whether farmers in that region continue the practice, but this was the case in the 1960s during the excavation. Apart from this, the major legacy of the Harappan civilization in terms of agriculture is the growing of barley and wheat, which were the two main staple crops, apart from a lot of pulses and vegetables and so on. But barley and wheat will migrate into the Ganges Valley, where it was unknown in the first millennium BC, whereas the Ganges region was growing rice very early on. The present dates we have go all the way back to 7000 BC, Neolithic period, and this growth of rice, this rice-based agriculture must have migrated westward into the Harappan civilization, because a little bit of rice cultivation, not much, but a little bit has come up at a few sites like Lothal or Harappa. So, but then we have the legacy of barley and wheat cultivation. Lots of objects of daily use in the Harappan civilization have survived and persisted, like this conch shell whose tip has been sewn off. As you can see, the tip is gone. This means you can use it for trumpeting. You know, the use of the conch shell is well documented. It is used in temples, it is used on the battlefield, as texts like Mahabharata tell us, and it is used in different contexts, but this is a Harappan technique. And there is another technique which consists in cutting open the whole mouth, not the tip but the whole mouth of the conch here is cut open. It can be used as a kind of a spoon or ladle. So this is also still in use nowadays. For example, in many pujaris, many priests, this you can see easily in Kerala, for example, will use this to make an offering of water, offering of oil, whatever it may be. And here those incised lines were filled with red pigment, which indicates a ritual use also. It was not just a kitchen implement, apparently, if we can judge from these incised lines which were filled with pigment. So now I move on to another field, very fascinating and usually neglected field, iconography. What is iconography? It is the science and technique of symbols, icons and their properties, their sizes, their proportions, the attributes of these statues. All of it is a huge field which mingles sometimes with art history, sometimes also with symbolism. And here, for example, I begin with this particular symbol on the left, which is from a copper plate at Mohenjo-daro, which is known as the endless knot symbol. Why endless knot? Because, well, you can keep tracing it forever. So this is an interesting symbol and it has survived. In classical India, this is from a Gujarati inscription of 884 CE or AD, and it is even found in Fatehpur Sikri, obviously borrowed from the earlier phases. This is in the medieval time, and this symbol is in the central inscription. It is an emblem of royalty. Whether it was that in the Harappan context, again, is impossible to tell. Possibly, but we can't be sure. It is found also in rangolis, you know, columns. Rangolis are those intricate sketches, diagrams drawn with various, chalk powders and stone powders, color powders by ladies in front of the houses or during festivals. And this is very commonly used, and in that context, it represents the footprint of Krishna. So this is a symbol which comes to us from the Harappan civilization, and this one is even more spectacular and better known. It is the swastika. On the left is a Harappan terracotta tablet. There were hundreds of them depicting the swastika. Single swastika, double swastika, clockwise, anti-clockwise, everything was covered. Now, of course, in Vedic, Hindu, Buddhist, Jain traditions, the swastika is a symbol of auspiciousness, well-being, right? In the Harappan context, once again, we cannot certify the exact significance of the symbol, but in this case, we can document the transmission through this late culture, which is known as painted grey ware culture, which is predominant in the late 2nd millennium BC in the Ganga Yamuna region in particular. There are several pots of this painted grey ware culture which do depict also the swastika. So the swastika comes to us also from the Harappan culture. Then tree worship, Harappans worship trees. This is well documented in a number of tablets. Some of them, like this one, show the tree raised on a platform, which is how we can say that it is, an object of worship, right? It was revered. And the same symbolism survived on these punchmark coins which I was telling you about, like those found at Takshila and many, many other Indo-Gangetic cities of the Gangetic civilization from 600 BC onward till about, if I'm not mistaken, till about 200 AD or CE, those punchmark coins will be in use, and many of them use this symbol. But there are many other symbols. This is the work of Savita Sharma and also Fabry, British scholar working in the 1930s. And we find that some of the symbols found on the Indus seals, though they may not be decipherable, they may not be understood, they, however, survive and they are transmitted somehow to coins of the punch-marked kind which I was showing you earlier. And these coins have very similar symbols. So when, of course, simple geometric shapes are going to recur independently. They are not a proof of transmission. But when the shapes become more complex, you see, like these, for example, more elaborate, more, not so geometrical anymore, then you can, and when it all accumulates, you can claim that there is a high degree of probability that these symbols on the punchmark coins had Harappan antecedents. Fabry, whom I mentioned earlier, Fabry also concentrated on entire motifs of Indus seals, like this one, for example, where you have a typical unicorn standing in front of a ritual stand with this script on top. This is a typical, very typical Harappan seal. And on punchmark coins, he found one coin where there is a bull and some symbol where the script used to be in the Harappan context, and again some kind of a stand in front of the bull. So this is also fairly convincing of transmission of symbols. Apart from this, as far as the iconography is concerned, this is the famous Pashupati seal of Harappan seals. It is there in almost all textbooks. The exact meaning of it is not certain. I'll come back to it if time permits. But whatever the meaning, you have a great figure in a yogic posture on a raised platform where there are two antelopes or gazelles below. One is partly broken here, but we can still see the horns. And he is exuding a sense of mastery over this tiger, elephant, rhinoceros, and buffalo. But what is remarkable is that there are very clearly 1, 2, 3 faces. Now this is an antecedent of the classical way of representing Hindu gods with multiple heads or faces. And this is something which is repeated on a few Harappan seals, and we can very well propose that this will initiate the later classical Hindu iconography in this regard, as well as also the tradition of showing gods in yogic postures This is, for example, a statue of the Buddha. If it's a photo I took, I'm sorry that the quality of the photo is not very good because of poor lighting. But this is from the Ajanta caves, where you can see the Buddha seated slightly in a different pose. This is not the same Mulabandhasana of this so-called Pashupati seal. This is Padmasana, of course. Nevertheless, he is seated on a raised platform, and below the platform, you have two deer facing each other exactly like what you see in the Pashupati seal. So this seems to be too much again of a coincidence, and we may propose, we never have any definite proofs, in all these conjectures, but by simply accumulating the coincidences, then we build up a fairly reasonably strong case for transmission, and this is definitely one case of this. Another iconographic possible transmission is the use in Harappan seals, like tablets like this one, of an arch over a god, a standing god, emerging as if from this arch. What is this arch? In the Harappan world, these are people leaves. People, is the Ashwatha tree, the fig, one of the two main fig trees of India, the other being the banyan tree. This is Ficus religiosa. This is known as people in Hindi, or Ashwatha. In Sanskrit, in Tamil it is Arsamaram. In Malayalam I used to know the name. It is Ara something, but I'm not very sure now, so I won't try. But this is the people. Now, this becomes, in the classical Indian statuary, this becomes actually flames. But the same arch, flames of fire, but the same arch is there. And this is, of course, a figurine of Shiva, bronze figurine of the Chola era, so much, much later. Sometimes, instead of an arch, the people branches open up like this on this particular seal, and you can see the people leaf here very, very clearly marked. Even though those seals, mind you, those seals are no bigger than this, and sometimes even half of this. And in spite of this small size, they were able to point to a lot of detail, amazing number of detail, in fact. So this is decorated arches with people leaves, as I showed you, and this is on a pot, Harappan pot, the very detailed people design. And this is very important because the people tree is sacred to the Harappans as it is sacred in the Vedic culture. So here we have also one more parallel. So this is the people leaves as they are depicted on these two seals. One more example of iconographic transmission is from the figurine of Mother Goddess in the Harappan world. You have this Mother Goddess here. I will explain in a few minutes why these are identified with Mother Goddess worship. But you have this extravagant headdress of big flowers, which is repeated here on a figurine of 200 BC, more than 2000 years later, a so-called Mathura style of statue. And this is from terracotta on the left also. And you have this big headdress of huge flowers common to both. Huge earrings, you can see the earrings here and here also on the same side. Then a kind of a necklace and a second necklace with a pendant in both cases, and some kind of a belt also. So there is a strong likeness between the two, though we are more than 2 millennia apart. And this was noted by many art historians like Stella Kramrisch, for example, the well-known art historian who wrote at length on the Indian art and on such continuities, which is sometimes traced to the Harappan art traditions. Some iconography has apparently disappeared. This is the famous Harappan unicorn, which you find on many seals, in fact hundreds of them. This is the most represented design on Harappan or Indus seals. And again, please keep in mind that this object is no bigger than this. It is made of steatite or soft stone, which was heated at high temperature to harden the stone so that the seal could be used to make prints on soft clay or other material. So this is the Indus script at the top, this is the ritual stand, and this is the unicorn. Now, some people point out to the fact that this design has not survived. And it is true, I'm not aware of the unicorn being depicted, but in the classical literature, the concept of unicorn does appear. It appears in the Rig Veda, first of all, where bulls with sharpened horns, or sometimes a sharpened horn, are invoked, usually in context of invoking a particular god like Indra. And in Mahabharata, Krishna himself says that he was known in olden days as Ekashringa. Ekashringa means precisely one horn. So though it is true that the iconography has been abandoned here, in this case, the concept did survive. Now back to the so-called Pashupati seal with this Mula Bandhasana posture. This gives us the classic continuity with the in iconography which I have mentioned earlier. And in other postures, the god has a simpler expression, still three faces. As you can see, three noses are clearly visible. In this case, there is even a branch of people emerging from the top of the god. But here what I want to highlight is yoga or yogic mastery. This is very clearly implied by the whole atmosphere of the seal. This is also now, I'm moving on to the more intangible heritage in the sense of the religious aspect of Harappan life. And here we have two such objects which any traditional Indian would immediately recognize as a Shivalingam. And there are only two of them, one at Kalibangan, one at Harappa, which have come to us in situ, that is to say, excavated right at the spot. There may have been more, and there may have been smaller objects intended to be a lingam, but this is not very clear. These two are quite clear. In addition, you have this example of trident or trishula on several seals, and in fact the trishula becomes one of the signs in the Harappan script, the system of symbols of the Harappan script. One of them is the trishula. So does this point to a cult of a proto-Shiva? This has been submitted by a number of scholars. It is quite possible. We cannot again be sure because we don't have the literature. So even if there was a god, possibly our Pashupati of previous seals, which was regarded as a kind of a Shiva, we cannot guarantee that this was the name under which he was worshipped, right? The distinction has to be kept in mind. But the persistence of these objects and symbols is now fairly strongly documented. Now, more about the religion. This is the mother goddess I was telling you about. Why mother goddess? Well, because of these two cups which you see on either side of the head. And the two cups, the traces of soot were actually found at the bottom of these cups, which means that they were actually used as oil lamps. So a figurine with two oil lamps on either side is not an ordinary figurine. It is not an ordinary woman, let us say. It is something that suggests worship. So therefore, archaeologists from the beginning proposed that this is a cult to the mother goddess. And of course, mother goddess is an essential part of later Hinduism. And also later Buddhism and Jainism to some extent. So this could be an antecedent in the Harappan civilization. This is about, I remind you, intangible heritage. How now we have to speculate more, whereas the tangible heritage usually is beyond speculation or pretty clear. Here we have to speculate a little more. For example, here, scholars like Mark Kenoyer in this case have speculated that these tablets depicting the slaying of a buffalo and ritual slaying because of the same god here in the same yogic posture as we saw before, witnessing the scene. If it was simply slaying a buffalo for eating its meat, you would not place such a god on the side. So there is a ritualness to it, and it does remind us of two things. First of all, slaying of buffalo is a custom in several Indian tribes. In South India, for example, the Toda tribe did practice this ritual slaying of a buffalo at the time of a death, after the death of one of their members. They don't practice it so much anymore nowadays, still once in a while. And apart from this, there is the tradition of Mahishasura Mardini. Mahishasura Mardini is a name of Durga, as you know, and she is known as the slayer of the buffalo, right? So is that anticipated in the Harappan scene which you witness here? Well, it's a matter of opinion in the end, but there is certainly a strong parallelism. Animal sacrifice is, of course, an integral part of popular Hinduism. It was also an integral part of Harappan religion, and several such sacrificial pits have been found, though not, as I can remember, as well constructed as this one in Kalibangam again, where you see how neatly the bricks have been laid for this pits where only animal bones have been found, only animal bones. So this shows us that they were practicing animal sacrifice. Then back to the Great Bath, where you see this very beautifully built brick structure. I will not dilate on the technique of construction for lack of time, but what is this bath intended for? You see, initially John Marshall, when he excavated it, proposed that this was some kind of a Turkish bath, where you can have hot water bath or steam bath perhaps and so on. But this hypothesis was quickly discounted. It's not something that you would commonly practice in a hot climate to start with. So then two hypotheses remain. One is this: it is the pleasure bath of the king or the emperor. But the problem with this hypothesis is that in Harappan civilization, the king or ruler, or the kings or rulers, if you accept that there were, many different regions, each one with its particular king, is fairly invisible. There is no palace, for example, no place where we can say with certainty that the king was living here. We can only say that he must have lived somewhere on the upper city, in the Acropolis. Very likely not in the lower town. So, but apart from this, in the iconography, for example, we have no depiction of rulers, no depiction of kings, no depiction of, a king leading its army, conquering an adversary, or simply sitting on a throne, or whatever. So the king is never portrayed, and his palace or palaces are also not visible on the landscape. And therefore, it's not very sure whether the king in Mohenjo-daro would have had such a basin for his own use. The third explanation has been that this is a ritual bath, as D.D. Koshambi again called it a pushkarani, that is to say, something like the tanks associated with temples in later classical Hinduism. In fact, it might be the prototype of a temple tank, a pushkarani. So this is of course quite possible. And in that case, those cells here, we have 12, if I remember well, 12 cells all around the Great Bath would make sense, because this would be the cells, the rooms where the priests would change themselves, would have a bath before the conducting the ritual. So, well, this is an object of conjecture once again, but it is quite a strong possibility. Now, fire worship is more controversial because some people, especially those who want to promote the Aryan migration, are not comfortable with the idea that Harappans may have worshipped fire, since fire worship is usually associated with the Vedic ritualism. So, normally you want this to have come into India later, right? And therefore, these identifications of fire altars have been challenged, even though no good alternatives, to my knowledge, have been proposed. For example, this structure in Lothal, you can see this is a scale of 1 meter. The structure is huge. It is 2.6 by 2.7 meters. So it is too big to be something that you would use for cooking, number one. Number two, it's located in a street. It's in a public space. It is not in a house. And number three, when they excavated the center, they found only ash and terracotta nodules, lumps of terracotta. They did not find actually triangles of terracotta. They never found here bones, which you would expect if this was used for cooking purposes. So if it is not for cooking and if it is in a public place, what could it be used for? And why should you keep such a huge jar next to it? The simplest explanation, this is what S.R. Rao proposed, is that this was a fire altar and the offering, possibly some ghee or some oil, was taken from the jar and poured into the altar. And in fact, there is even a platform here and another there. This is a post hall. There are several of them, which means that probably this structure had a superstructure covering it, and therefore it all evokes the conduct of fire rituals. This is of great importance. We have more evidence from this structure at Banawali, where this semicircular room, you can see the scale given to you by this worker, had only inside this semicircular altar. And when the excavator, again Dr. Aris Bisht, excavated this center, he found 1 foot thick of ash. So 1 foot thick of ash and nothing else again, no animal bones, does suggest the conduct of fire offering. And in that case, the whole building would be a kind of a fire temple. There is more evidence from Kalibangan, where a row of 7 altars, 2 of them having been removed by this later drain, 7 altars were found facing the east. And more structures at Kalibangan were proposed to be fire altars. And this is something that even Raymond Alchin, who visited Kalibangan during the excavation, was convinced of and accepted. So altogether, we have, and these are more structures in Vagad, in Saurashtra, which Dr. Sonawani identified with fire altars again. So if there is fire worship in the Harappan civilization, and at least some regions of it, no such structures have come to light in Mohenjo-daro or Harappa, or they might have been missed, then it is a strong indicator of a possible connection with Vedic culture. And this has to be kept in mind. So, lastly, yoga, and I have already mentioned the seals with those figurines in yogic posture, but we have actual figurines, not on the seals, which are made of terracotta like this one. So this is the sign of Namaste, again Namaste with a cross-legged, some other posture. It looks as if, and this has been proposed by several scholars, it looks as if some kind of Hatha Yoga, let us not use the term because it was not probably so systematically developed as Hatha Yoga as we know it, but something existed and was sufficiently important to be depicted as figurines. The Harappans did not depict many scenes. They were rather stingy as far as art production is concerned. And we don't have many scenes of Harappan life. So whatever is depicted certainly was regarded as culturally important, and this is the case. And the priest king in an attitude which can only be described as meditative or contemplative. Priest-king is an arbitrary designation given by the early archaeologists. There is no way to tell whether this person is a priest or a king, or whether it is simply some kind of a rishi or some kind of a yogi. All these designations would be purely a matter of choice, but the attitude is unusual. You do not depict a king in a deep contemplation. So some intention is there, and there is more continuity with the way the dress is worn over the left shoulder, which is still the traditional way of wearing the upper cloth in India. Continuity with the presence of a bead at the center of the forehead, where, often nowadays the tilak is applied, and continuity also with the presence of a bead holder on the upper right arm, where Orthodox Hindus very commonly wear some kind of a blessing holder or a rudraksha or some other. So this has a strong message of continuity altogether. So to sum up the Harappan legacy, transmission of concepts of urbanism, technologies and crafts, survival of symbols and iconographic features, probable presence of fire worship, limited linga worship. You can see that I'm using cautious words of probable and limited because I don't want to be dogmatic in my assertions, but nevertheless the documentation is pretty strong. And please note that most of these hypotheses have been proposed by Western archaeologists first, before Indian scholars. Hints to a tradition of yoga, yogic posture and meditation, worship of the people tree, also sacred in the Veda, and many aspects common to popular Hinduism, such as tree worship, worship of a mother goddess, and animal sacrifice. This is why we have now the concept of a cultural continuum rather than a cultural break, as proponents of the Aryan migration wanted it to be in the second millennium. We have a cultural continuum between the Harappan civilization of the 3rd millennium BC and the classical civilization of the 1st millennium BC, re-emerging in the Ganges and Indus plains. So John Marshall in 1931, though he did not have much material to go by at that time, he was nevertheless struck by the fact that the Harappan religion is so characteristically Indian as hardly to be distinguished from still living Hinduism. This is a very strong statement of continuity, and which actually goes against the Aryan migration, even though he supported the Aryan migration himself. Current studies of the transition between the two early urban civilizations, that is to say Harappan and Gangetic, claim that there was no significant break or hiatus. This is by Jonathan Marquenoy, whom I have referred to a few times already earlier, and therefore he says there is no break between the two civilizations. This is again a strong statement. Jim Schaffer, another prominent American archaeologist, if I insist on Western scholars, please forgive me. It is not that Indian scholars did not make the same statements. They did. Indian archaeologists also came up with very strong statements. But because of the highly polemical atmosphere created around the Aryan migration theory, Indian scholars are not trusted in India. And this is a very unfortunate development. But they are accused of having all kinds of motives. I will come back to this afternoon if I have time. But when the Western scholars are invoked, then we have complete silence in response, and nobody can accuse them of being Hindu chauvinists or Hindutva activists or whatnot. So this is the strategic reason why I am using Western names, not that the Indian scholars are in any way inferior. So James Schaffer said, the previous concept of a dark age in South Asian archaeology, and I remind you, that is the dark age which is supposed to have followed the Aryan migration in the 2nd millennium BC, is no longer valid, because this 2nd millennium BC has been filled up now with all these exemplars of continuity and many more. So while the Harappan cities do disappear and do disintegrate, the culture lives on and is to some extent, to a large extent apparently, transmitted to the new civilization appearing in the first millennium BC. And therefore, this is, yesterday we had the negative verdict of archaeology, no evidence of coming of the Aryans, and today we have the positive verdict of archaeology that the cultural transmission is well documented between the two civilizations, and there is no break as we would have expected if the Aryan migration had taken place. So I end to this morning's session with this, and if you have the patience, you're welcome to join me again at 3 o'clock for the concluding and last talk in this series. Thank you very much.